Good, I was going to ask him about that. You can go ahead.
Welcome everybody to our lunch event today, hosted by the Institute of Bill of Rights Law. Today we have some distinguished panelists who will be guiding us through the First Amendment in the Trump era. So please give it over to Professor Zick, Professor Nadine Strossen, and Robert Corn-Revere.
This is how you make an entrance. Just take that to the
Hey, I like your T-shirt because now. It's really appropriate. Okay, Boomer. That's like, it's a pro-free speech meme now.
Well, I think everyone here knows me. I'm Tim Zick, and I teach and write about the First Amendment, and I'm so delighted to have two First Amendment authorities with me here to talk about my new book, The First Amendment in the Trump Era. Nadine Strossen, who was for a long time the president of the ACLU and is now at New York Law School, and Robert Corn-Revere, who just got here from D.C., who's at Wright Tremaine, and is a prominent First Amendment litigator. So I'm going to talk for a few minutes about the book, and then I'm going to have what I hope is a good conversation with my panelists, and then we'll try to leave some time for questions for the audience. So the first thing I want to do is point out the cover of the book, which I'm very proud of. It has Trump's name on it. I have read somewhere that he's more likely to pay attention to things with his name on them. So I went a step further. I gave him a whole era, right, the Trump era, and I figure, whether he reads it or not, if he mentions it to his tens of millions of followers, it can only help my book sales. And the other thing about the cover is it's orange. And that is my publisher's doing, not mine. So my publisher may have a sense of humor. This is a unique book for me. This is my fourth book on the First Amendment. This is the only one that I've tried to write in more or less real time, which creates certain complications. It is far less academic in both the pejorative and non-pejorative aspects of that term. It is not heavily doctrinal. I talk about important cases, but I try not to get too bogged down in them. It's only 135 pages of actual text, so it is a light lift. It's very svelte, and I wanted to reach a broader audience than my academic books, which is part of the reason that I wrote it in that fashion. Let me talk about why I wrote the book and some of the challenges related to writing it. I'll start with the challenge part first. I think it's fair to say that no president, maybe no public official in the history of the United States has talked more about, or in this case tweeted more about, free press and free speech concerns. So just trying to keep up with the torrent of events and statements and policies that have come out has been a particular challenge, to say the least. The president did not cooperate with my production schedule, so there are examples that post-date my turning in the manuscript, and maybe we can talk about some of those during our conversation. I suspect they will not be the last free speech and press controversies in this administration. With regard to motives, why did I write the book? A couple of different reasons. I wanted to chronicle what the president has been saying and in some cases doing with regard to free speech and press. So I got interested in this topic back during the 2016 campaign when the president first started talking about opening up the libel laws. He encouraged his rally audiences to maybe not treat so nicely, I think those were his words, some of the disruptive protesters. And he even said, and some of you may remember this, that we should shut down parts of the internet to thwart terrorist speakers. So by the time now President Trump was in first couple of years of his first term, I already had plenty of material for the book. But I didn't just want to chronicle and collect these examples. I wanted to contextualize them politically, socially, culturally, and constitutionally. And I wanted to, in doing that, try to explain and understand the implications of what I'm calling the Trump era. What does it say with regard to our current First Amendment, this era, and what might it portend for the future of the First Amendment if and when there is a post-Trump era, as I'm sure there will be at some point. And last, just to be totally honest, this was a form of professional therapy for me, because the President has said so many things that are just flat wrong about the First Amendment, or as I see it anyway, inconsistent with its core principles, that I felt like anything other than a book would not be an adequate response. Having said all that, I do see this book more as pro-First Amendment than as anti-Trump. I have a lot to say that's critical about what the President has said and done. At the end of the day, I want to make a robust defense of the First Amendment's press and speech guarantees. Now, with regard to the Trump era, some might think it's too early to define an era in Trumpian terms. I think in some respects, maybe. I'll let historians grapple with the policy implications of the Trump administration. But if you think about past presidents and their influence over the First Amendment, or the controversies that roiled their presidencies, I think you can identify different eras, including, for example, the John Adams era, which was punctuated by enforcement of the Sedition Act of 1798, which authorized government to jail critics of the current administration, and in fact, dozens of Adams critics did go to jail for violating the Sedition Act. Fast forward to World War I and Woodrow Wilson, where you had efforts to suppress wartime dissent, to ensure the, quote, loyalty of government employees and the use of propaganda. And, of course, the Nixon era, who could forget the enemies list that President Nixon had with regard to members of the press, among others, and some very famous First Amendment precedents coming out of the Nixon era. So all of those eras are characterized, by the way, by criticism of the press and by a distaste for dissent. No president likes to be told that their policies are wrong or that they are wrong. And so in that sense, the current president is simply following historical norms and patterns. There are things that are very different about the Trump era, as I see it, and some very distinctive aspects with regard to free speech and press. So I just want to spend a couple of minutes talking about the statements and actions that I think help to characterize this era. And the first is the obvious, the war on the press, calling the press, institutional media, and individual reporters the enemy of the American people, referring to individual reporters as horrible and scum, in fact, taking away the press credentials, seemingly based on critical coverage of some D.C. Press and reporters. You have the co-optation of the phrase fake news, which actually used to mean something, and now is treated as treating fake things as real and real events as not what you're seeing and hearing out there. There is the sort of push to, as the President says, open up the libel laws, which, as I understand it, is not a disagreement with New York Times versus Sullivan and Supreme Court precedents, but rather a way to damage and punish the press through civil awards. The President has revoked the security clearances of critics who've spoken out against his administration. He is still calling treasonous the publication of an op-ed by an apparent member of his administration who was critical of the President's policies. He's called political protests embarrassing. He has encouraged the criminalization, the jailing of flag burners and their denaturalization, stripping them of their citizenship. He has blocked Twitter critics simply because they criticized him or his policies. He's attacked NFL players who refused to stand at attention as he saw fit during the national anthem.
Tim, if I can, what, this is sounding so much like the Declaration of Independence with the Bill of Particulars.
Yes,
Really
I'm almost finished. So, more seriously, threats to investigate. The threat to investigate Google for its algorithm, media institutions, and even Saturday Night Live for its alleged bias and satire. And then the threat to use the postal laws and the antitrust laws, again, against critics like Jeff Bezos of Amazon and the Washington Post. Now, Trump supporters will say you shouldn't take any of that literally and or seriously, but I think it's a mistake to normalize any of the bill of particulars that I just mentioned. Even if no media company is financially ruined, no reporter goes to jail for critical coverage, and no flag burner is denaturalized, there can be significant damage to the First Amendment. So what are the distinctions of this era? As I mentioned, the nature of the war on the press, the character of that, it's very public and not private. It is vitriolic. It is constant. It treats the press as, again, an enemy of the people. The suppression of dissent is distressingly common during wartime, but during the Trump presidency, it's been a time of relative peace. The president has insisted on loyalty, in the Wilsonian sense, maybe, but I think more particularly, he wants loyalty to himself, to the person of the president, and not to the nation as he sees it. And last, the possible abuse of powers of office that we don't know everything about yet, but that mirrors some of the abuses that President Nixon was accused of and eventually caused his undoing. So I think instead of just a war on the press, what I think I've identified is a war on dissent in all of its various forms. So not just reporters, not just people who report critically on the administration, but anyone who dares to engage in dissenting behavior or communication. And the president didn't create his era any more than previous presidents had. The era is the product of what I call some pre-existing conditions. Let me just talk about a few of those, and then we'll get to the discussion. So the media landscape has changed dramatically. As you know, because of digitization, there has been a loss of revenues and subscriptions. There have been changed relationships over time between reporters and government officials. There's been a depressed judicial support for freedom of the press. And in addition to all of those things, which some scholars have pointed to as the last straw and not the opening salvo with respect to freedom of the press, we have a digital speech culture that traffics in hate speech and flash controversies. We have deep cultural cleavages with regard to race and class and religion and patriotism. We have a declining trust in institutions and experts. And we have the rise of a post-truth culture. So Trump sits as the archetype of this era I'm describing in a sort of central way. He's hyper-communicative, he's hyper-combative, he's hyper-partisan, and he's deeply polarizing. So with that heavy last part, right, let me turn to my panelists here and serve as my own critic or moderator, whatever you want to call it. And I thought I'd start with an opening question that's fairly broad in scope. So one criticism one might have of the book is that despite all of the bill of particulars that I've laid out, it overstates matters to say that the First Amendment is in peril because no reporter has been jailed for critical coverage. No media company has actually been investigated and financially ruined. So what do you make of that claim, that this is all an overreaction to the Trump Twitter account?
Could we move this so we can see
Yeah,
people
sure.
who are sitting there? I can help you too. Excellent, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Now we can see you.
Okay.
Do you want to go first?
How much of it is an overreaction? Well, we all know Trump says stupid and horrible things. Is that a crime? Is that a constitutional violation? It's like the motto of this administration is let no deranged thought go unexpressed. But most presidents hate the press, and a lot of presidents say horrible things about the press. And so what has that got to do with the First Amendment, other than the fact that those of us who work in this business value the First Amendment, and it appears the president does not. So it's a political issue, right? And not a legal issue. And as a matter of fact, if you look at most administrations in the past, and Professor Zick mentioned in the distant past, the John Adams administration, and so on, you actually had writing critical articles about the administration to be a crime, and that's certainly not where we are now. But we have seen this happen with the abuse of power over time. In fact, most presidents engage in one form or another of trying to use their official power to affect the press. FDR wiretapped reporters that he didn't like. His son, in a book, said that his father probably invented the process of using tax audits to go after members of the press he didn't like. There was a grand jury that investigated the Chicago Tribune for violations of the Espionage Act under FDR. So there's a lot of that in the background. Under the Kennedy administration, there was a program started in the White House, the Democratic National Committee, working in combination with the White House to bring fairness doctrine complaints through the FCC against right-wing radio hosts. That program was continued into the LBJ administration. It was finally exposed in the 70s through Fred Friendly writing his book, The Good Guys, the Bad Guys, and the First Amendment. Nixon, we all know about Nixon, because of the impeachment hearings and the evidence that came to light about break-ins in Daniel Ellsberg's psychiatrist's office, wiretapping reporters, having an enemies list, much like today, and threatening to challenge the Washington Post's broadcast licenses for critical Watergate coverage. Under the Reagan administration, not as many examples there, but he did, under at least his CIA, tried to use the fairness doctrine and was found to have standing to use the fairness doctrine to challenge stories about the intelligence community and to try and suppress those stories. Under the Obama administration, there were more leak investigations and prosecutions than all previous administrations in history combined. So they all have their issues. What we see that is different about the Trump administration is that he admits it in real time, apparently believing that brags about it, believing that admitting you're doing it means that it isn't a crime. For all of the other administrations, it usually takes investigations or decades before this information comes to light. But Trump not only says what he's going to do, once he does it, he announces that's what he did. A lot of people will talk about how this is simply the exercise by a public official of his own First Amendment rights. The problem is governments have powers, not rights. Individuals have rights. And so once this translates into some form of policy, then it does become not just an exercise in loudishness, but a constitutional problem. And so, as you may have mentioned, I think it was in the introduction that I'm currently working on a case involving Penn America Center, suing the Trump administration, suing Trump personally, actually, for violating the First Amendment. Penn America has existed for about 100 years. It represents writers, artists, reporters, and we're representing them on behalf of their news organization and journalist members who have been affected by various actions of the Trump administration, and they include some of the examples that you mentioned. For example, some of the high-profile ones are removing the press credentials of reporters at the White House that are, as they say, showing insufficient respect for the president. Jim Acosta is a notable one, but there are others. There have been various actions announced both during the campaign and that are ongoing today against Amazon, because Jeff Bezos owns the Washington Post. And so Trump has announced both at rallies and through tweets that he wants to look at their tax status. He specifically demanded the post office start a rate review of the postal rates for commercial rates for Amazon shipping packages. Most recently in the news, and this is actually after we filed the complaint, just in the last couple of weeks, the announcement that Amazon was not going to get the cloud computing contract for the Pentagon, the JEDI contract, but that was being instead going to be awarded to Microsoft. And in some of the news accounts, some of the books that are coming out, saying that Trump specifically telling people in the background of the White House, fuck Amazon, we're giving this to Microsoft. And so you see those kinds of actions, not just bad statements declaring that the press is the enemy, but government policy being changed as a result, specifically to punish news organizations or journalists that he considers to be hostile. He demanded that the AT&T Time Warner merger be subjected to antitrust review, and actually the Justice Department brought an antitrust case to block that merger because, of course, Trump hates CNN. The court rejected that bid, but nonetheless, there was an attempt to use government power to punish CNN. And, of course, there have been frequent tweets threatening broadcast licenses, most notably NBC's, because, of course, Saturday Night Live is on NBC. So there are numerous examples of where it's not just statements declaring the press the enemy and releasing memes where you see President Trump beating up a CNN-headed wrestler. Instead, what you actually see are actual government policies or attempts to use government policies to punish a hostile press. This is new. This is something we haven't seen before. And so the question will be whether or not the courts are willing to step in, despite the fact that you have the exercise of executive power, and say that this really can't continue.
I fully applaud everything that Bob and Tim have said. I wish it were an exaggeration, but it's not, even though we, throughout history, have had not only a tension between the president and the press, but actually, I think all politicians and all human beings really have a very ambiguous enthusiasm at best about freedom of speech. Nat Hentoff, who was a journalist, died a number of years ago, wrote a book whose title really said it all. Freedom of speech for me, but not for thee. How the left and right relentlessly censor each other. And I constantly see it in so many contexts, including on so many campuses where students want to have freedom of speech, except for an idea that they consider to be particularly repugnant. And that is not only confirmed by many anecdotes that I'm sure you've read, but also by public opinion surveys, which show that a substantial percentage of the American public in all age ranges, but more so in younger age ranges, not boomers, believe that essentially offensive speech should be censored. On the issue of defamation, I have to chuckle because it's well known that Trump, starting from the time that he was a candidate, has been asking for defamation laws to be loosened up. And a couple of months ago, I was testifying in Congress about disinformation, among other things, on social media. And it was shortly after the doctored Nancy Pelosi videos had come to light. I was testifying with top people from Google, Twitter, and Facebook, and I was the First Amendment expert, so I had to explain how, as all of you who have been fortunate to take courses from Tim and Neil and other great faculty members know, telling a lie is actually usually constitutionally protected, with very few exceptions, including a very stringently limited defamation rule when you are talking about matters of public concern. And so I actually had this progressive liberal Democrat from California cross-examining me, and Professor Strossen, how can you possibly say that defamation should be protected? We ought to change the law. And I said, well, that's exactly what President Trump has been saying. And everybody burst out laughing. And kind of sheepishly, he said, well, maybe we could collaborate on that. There's something different about, I think that in part everything is exaggerated now. But there, as Tim so well explains, I mean, with Trump's hyperbole, everything is like the ultimate, including his attacks on the press. But Tim very well lays out in the book the fact that there's a perfect storm for attacks on the First Amendment, given all the other institutional problems and frailties that are besetting the media. with the traditional media facing economic and trust issues, the online media facing a whole host of other issues. And so being an activist, I always see the glass half full. Wow, 100% full. And what I know from my years with the ACLU is that the problems are constant, but when there is a particularly flamboyant demon as a president or a Supreme Court nominee or an attorney general, suddenly the public becomes much more galvanized and joins the hardcore civil libertarians who know that this is always a problem and become more receptive to acting, to understanding that it's a problem and doing something about it. So I see Trump's assaults as an opportunity in addition a mixed one. Okay, well, I see it as an opportunity. You can throw in the mixed thing later on to raise people's consciousness about how very, very, very much is at stake. I also want to say something about the president exercising his own free speech rights, which has been talked about. It is a bully pulpit, and he has a right in his personal capacity to express his viewpoints, but it is also a responsibility, right, to use that prominent platform to advance positive values through exercising his free speech rights. I wrote a book that Neil was kind enough to invite me to speak about a few months ago here, Hate, Why We Should Resist It with Free Speech, Not Censorship, and Tim has a whole chapter about hate speech in which he rightly criticizes Trump for, rather than raising his voice to denounce hateful and stereotyping and discriminatory expressions and even hateful and violent conduct, he's doing the opposite. He's fanning the flames of discrimination and distrust. So not only is he attacking other people's free speech rights and violating them, he is abusing the opportunity or misusing the opportunity to do a lot of good by instead poisoning society and creating an atmosphere where, I'm not sure I'd go as far as you go, Tim. I was really parsing your words in the hate speech chapter, where, that the speech can lead to negative conduct. Hopefully it won't. Hopefully, there's been a chorus of counter speech against Trump himself. And again, there too, I can see the silver lining to the cloud. What happened after Trump said there were good people on both sides in Charlottesville? There was such a torrent of criticism. It is really amazing in retrospect when there are so few members of his party who will part company with him on anything. There were so many of them denouncing him on this. And leaders of the military. I think of every branch of the armed service, which is extraordinary because we have this wall between the military and civil spheres. But they felt so strongly that he had failed to raise his voice to denounce the hateful speech. And beyond that, Trump had two business councils of CEOs of major corporations who were advising him. They totally supported his economic policies, his financial policies, his tax policies, but they felt so strongly that countering hatred and discrimination and stereotyping was even more important, that they literally disbanded both of those councils over this issue. So ironically, his failures have propelled a very healthy counter reaction that I think on that issue has a net positive impact.
Well, I have obvious trouble giving him credit for some things. I tried. When I first proposed the book, my anonymous reviewer said this is too balanced. People thought I should just go for the throat. I said, no, I don't want to do that. I want to call some lessons from this era from our past and talk maybe a little bit about our future, he has raised important issues, right? It's the manner in which he raises them that makes them problematic. So just for example, there are, sound-minded people, not stable geniuses, but still sound-minded people who think Sullivan is wrong, right? That the defamation standard is too forgiving of the press, right? And we should open up the libel laws. But I think from his perspective, he's not coming at that from some kind of academic or even, interested. He's self-interested. Ironically, he'd get sued more than anyone, right? So that's the sort of irony of it. So I don't know if he's just talking or whatever, but I wanted to give him credit for that, but I couldn't.
Give him credit for knowing things?
Well, for at least, he clearly didn't know who could change the libel laws, right? State laws, right? You could go to the Supreme Court.
He talks about judges passing bills.
Yes. Well,
George Will had the greatest line about Donald Trump saying that he does not know what it means to know something. And keep in mind, I don't see this as a partisan exercise. I have little use for either party. I'm not a political person. It's really just about the abuse of power. And where you have this level of ignorance driving this many First Amendment issues, it's really something that needs to be addressed. And whether or not that presents an opportunity, I think it's a mixed opportunity because of how polarized our politics is right now. It's either seen as pro-Trump or anti-Trump. He has his base, he has people who like him, or people who hate the other side so much that they'll hold their nose and stand with him. And so you have this sort of endless tastes great, less filling debate going on with little content. And the problem is when you get into these discussions like whether or not Trump is destroying the First Amendment, it has the feel and can fall into the pattern of just a pro-Trump versus an anti-Trump debate. And it drains, I think, the importance of the First Amendment issues from their content when it gets reduced to political terms. Because as we know, politics diminishes or destroys everything it touches. And so the point is to return to the structure of government that this country was based on, to try and understand what the principles of the Republic are and how to preserve them. And I think to see things like the First Amendment as being the only way to do that.
And I think it's critically important that not only law students, but every person in this society, starting at a really early age, learns civics. The irony I was thinking is that the president would flunk a citizenship exam, right? He doesn't know them. But putting that aside, unfortunately, there is too much ignorance in general in our society about what used to be called basic civics.
Let's take Congress.
But certainly including freedom of speech. And we see so much ignorance and at best and hostility at worst. And it's not at all the unique attribute of Donald Trump and his supporters. Sadly, public opinion surveys show that many on the left, self-described Democrats and progressives, are very ignorant at best and hostile at worst toward freedom of speech. There's also reason to believe that the more people understand about how it functions, what its purpose is, who's benefited, what its history is, the more support there is. And I think
why it has to be neutral.
And why it absolutely has to be neutral, that you cannot, the ACLU famously or infamously defended freedom of speech for neo-Nazis in Skokie, Illinois, a town with a lot of Holocaust survivors. And in our brief in that case, we pointed out that the very same principles we were relying on there were used to defend freedom of speech for Martin Luther King and his supporters in Cicero, Illinois, because their views in that context, in the very same state, but different demographics, different politics, the exact same arguments were made. Well, it's hateful, it's hurtful, it's subversive, it's dangerous, it's threatening. And so I think it's really important for us to always look through the particular examples and see the underlying principle, and that no matter what our own ideas are, we have to defend free speech. And so I would say this is an opportunity. Let us not be like the president in our ignorance.
Yeah, I mean, that leads me to a concern I raised in the book. I mean, it's not all about Trump. So, I criticize the media for how it's behaving, right? There's a lot of pressure on the media in the digital era to behave certain ways, but, that's open to criticism, I think, and all of us, right? To the extent we're just following this lead and behaving just as he behaves. And I think of the NFL protest. That's a social and political protest that, for whatever reason, and I have a hard time accessing it, one side just cannot see that way. It ruins the game of football. Even though I don't have to watch it, they're not making any noise. There's no disruption of the game. So we have sort of this tyrannical, base minority that's insisting that everybody genuflect in the same way. And a president who says you should say Merry Christmas to everybody. That's when we'll be great, when everybody greets one another. And you say, well, who's stopping anyone from saying, this is the war on Christmas trope, right? So who's stopping anyone from doing that? No one.
Given that Trump seems to be widely disrespected in many circles, including many campus circles, I think realistically he's not going to exert much pressure in this kind of context. And as Tim and I were discussing earlier, a big concern is pressure from people we do respect, namely our peers, our fellow students, our faculty members, local community members. And again, there's so much evidence that people feel enormous social pressure to self-censor and to not express their viewpoints. In fairness, students who, a friend of mine just wrote a column in I can't remember which, Philadelphia Inquirer, I believe, about a student at a liberal college who was basically driven off campus because she was a Trump supporter. And, I feel embarrassed if anybody's a Trump supporter. I hope we haven't made you feel apologetic about that. This should be a place where you dare to, and hopefully it shouldn't take that much courage to express an idea, including about politics, that's going to be unpopular.
And yet that's part of the problem of what polarization has led to. Again, people choosing sides and deciding they're going to enforce that worldview against everybody else. So more conservative students, and given that most universities are trend more progressive than the general population, you have people who are afraid to, or at least hesitant to, say that they support Trump, or you have more militant folks expressing their support for Trump. Even the chalking incident, right, where you have people writing pro-Trump messages in chalk and having them reported for hate crimes.
I think just the name Trump.
Yeah,
in one case. That's all it was.
So again, you have this extreme polarization, each side thinking they can enforce their worldview onto the other, and it's an unhealthy situation.
Yeah. So what's to do sort of a pre-postmortem, what's the damage, if any, that has been done? I mean, it doesn't seem like it would be constitutional. Is it political, cultural, social? It sounds like that's what we're mostly talking about.
Well, can we start with the law? Because I have two of the world's greatest experts here, so I'd like to pick their brains. I mean, my perception is that the law, the constitutional law, is very good, that we have extremely strong support for a very robust concept of free speech, certainly for hate speech. I mean, the court, despite all of its ideological range and fragmentation on other issues, has by and large had quite a strong consensus, including justices with very different ideological perspectives on most of the important free speech issues. I don't know much about the two newest justices in that regard, and that's why if either of you knows anything about that, that would be helpful. But I do think that the bigger threat is much more in the culture and in the media, in the institutions. Many years ago, Zechariah Chapey, who was, I think, the first serious free speech scholar in the United States, he was at Harvard Law School, and he wrote the first treatise on the First Amendment in the first half of the 20th century. And he said, in the long run, people will have just as much freedom of speech as they want. And
Yeah.
what he meant was, we're not going to vote for a president or senators who will appoint justices who will be supportive of free speech.
Or Learned Hand's Spirit of
Yeah,
Liberty.
yes, exactly.
Judge Learned Hand gave a speech in 1945 called The Spirit of Liberty, in which he talked about how if the public doesn't support it, if it's not in the hearts and minds of the American people, that no law, no constitution is going to preserve freedom. And he wasn't talking specifically about freedom of speech, but he was talking about the civic culture that our system is based on. And I think that's the danger. I mean, I agree with Nadine that the First Amendment doctrine right now and the case law on First Amendment is very strong, very protective of the First Amendment. And the question is whether or not the philosophy on which it's based on civil discourse, rational discussion, rational decision-making, is up to the task. Do we have what you would call reasoned dialogue among our policymakers today? When was the last political debate that you actually saw ideas being discussed? When you have policy being made by Twitter account and issues raised in just little bursts of language rather than ideas being expressed, is that really what our system is based on? And I think getting back to a notion where you actually have dialogue about issues is what we have to find a way to do. And that's not a legal question, right? That's more of a social question.
In terms of the law, so we've had, correct me if I'm wrong, I think we've had 2 district courts weigh in on reporter credentials,
Yes.
revocations, both
That's
of them
right.
relying on the Due Process Clause and not the First
Exactly.
Amendment.
Well, mostly on the Due
Mostly.
Process Clause. There's an older case from the 70s, Sherrill versus Knight, that basically said if the White House is going to rescind press credentials, that given the fact that it involves a fundamental right, there has to be sound due process in that decision. It has to be based on actual reasoning, like national security reasons, and not just you dislike the reporter. And so when the Trump administration first withdrew the press credentials, the hard pass of Jim Acosta, it took about 10 days for a court and a Trump-appointed judge to hold that violated due process. More recently, it happened with Brian Karem, who was the White House correspondent for Playboy, where during July there was a social media summit at the White House where he invited mostly the right-wing cranks that peddle conspiracy theories. And they got into a snit with Brian Karem. And so shortly after that, the White House announced that they were going to suspend his press credentials for engaging in uncivil behavior. And again, that took about 10 days as well for the courts to decide that, it violated due process. There has not yet been a First Amendment test of whether or not press credentials have First Amendment protection, but keep in mind, no one has a First Amendment right to have a press pass to the White House. But because it is based on First Amendment interests, then there are legal protections, and so far that's been through due process. Similarly, with most of the other threats of policy actions against various press organizations, there is a sound legal doctrine saying that the government can't retaliate against the exercise of First Amendment rights, and that's a violation of the First Amendment. But the dividing line between criticism and retaliation, that's where it gets hard to prove.
Yeah.
I think not necessarily legal, but political or potentially regulatory issue, policy issue, that is really, really difficult is what has been surfacing in the last week or two when Facebook has staunchly said we are going to keep up political ads even if they contain lies, and Twitter going to seemingly the opposite extreme and saying we're not going to have any political ads at all. My perception from what I read is that Twitter is getting all the credits here and praise, and Facebook is being attacked. And I have to tell you, I'm seeing all the problems. I think that Facebook's approach is the lesser of two evils in this situation, because what is political, right? And Twitter expressly says that it is going to exclude not only ads for candidates, but also on issues. And think about, let me give you a very personal example. I did a video interview for a film. Apparently I'm the star of the film, except for some animation, about hate speech that was produced by the Federalist Society. And if I do say so, it's a terrific film, not because of what I said, but because of how well they edited it, really boiled it down. And it's an educational film intended for student audiences, a very important audience on this issue. And I heard a couple months ago from one of the top people at the Federalist Society saying, Nadine, we were trying to advertise this on YouTube, but they wouldn't let us because they decided that this is a political video. What? I'm talking about First Amendment principles. Well, in the very opening segment where I'm explaining that there is no legal concept of hate speech, but instead it's an epithet that's used to stigmatize any idea that the person using that phrase dislikes. And I was giving one example from each end of the political spectrum, and the example I give, so from the left end, I pointed out that a lot of people consider Black Lives Matter as hate speech, including the FBI. And then from the other end of the political spectrum, I said, Trump, your example, just the word Trump has been considered hate speech. Because I said Trump, Google in its wisdom decided that this was political, and they banned advertising. So there are umpteen other examples.
Yeah.
Let's see if we have questions from the audience. Been very patient. Yeah, Robert.
So it seems like arguably the most hostile group towards free speech is private corporations kind of monitoring what their employees or what their ads say. In California, there's a law that universities have to comply, even private universities have to comply with the First Amendment.
Yeah.
That seems interesting. Do you think it would have a positive effect on, I guess, the nation if more states followed that and apply it even beyond universities and to organizations such as YouTube to try and get more freedom of speech?
No.
And Bob speaks with expertise, having enforced federal regulation.
I used to work at the FCC, and one of the sayings we used to have when I was there was, "It's a good thing we're not the Consumer Product Safety Commission, or someone could get hurt." There's really no way for government to perform that oversight role. And if you're going to say that corporations then have to provide the same rights as government, who's going to police that? You put the government in charge of them. And if you're going to say that about any corporation, do you include newspapers? Do you include other organizations, other corporations that otherwise are in the First Amendment business? And once you do that, that means that they can no longer exercise editorial choice. And so it's really a difficult thing. Now, online platforms present a whole other issue, and Europe has approached this in a very different way, with giving the government much more latitude in policing what platforms can or must do. It has not, in my opinion, worked well, because I think it's deviated from what we understand as traditional protections for First Amendment. But there's really no end to it. So just for example, under the European Convention of Human Rights, if you have any kind of anti-religious speech, that can be banned as being contrary to the convention. And so what you're having is essentially the enforcement in Europe of blasphemy laws. And that includes applying that to speech on platforms and in general. And so, speaking as an atheist, I can tell you, I would be kind of upset if in this country we started enforcing blasphemy laws and applying that to online platforms or other corporate entities.
I'm sympathetic to, I also have an instinctive adverse reaction to government regulation, including, you may notice, some people, I think Yeah, you did mention this in your book, Tim, that Trump issued an executive order that would seem to be pro-free speech, in which he said that campuses that did not protect free speech would face losing their federal funding, including private campuses. Well, that might sound good. Who could be against free speech on campus? But the idea of the government enforcing that is really scary. So where I would come out, and where the ACLU actually has done a lot of work on that, is encouraging private sector entities, including employers, to create a culture in which they respect their employees' free speech rights, and the same thing for private campuses, because that's where people spend the bulk of their lives. And if we are going to inculcate habits and attitudes that are conducive to free speech, I think we really want to encourage those cultures, but not through government force.
And anytime you try and put the government in charge of those kinds of things, it's going to tragically go wrong, largely because of the influence of politics. Real-world example, Senator Josh Hawley from Missouri has introduced legislation to require social media platforms to be certified by the FTC to make sure that they aren't favoring one political party or another. That is, not censoring conservative viewpoints. What could possibly go wrong? And so what you're going to see is whoever happens to be in charge at a given time will try and skew that enforcement one way or the other. As I say, I used to be at the FCC. That's exactly how the Fairness Doctrine was operated. Partisans from either side would try and use that to put pressure on broadcast licensees and networks to skew their coverage in given ways. And it never worked as a practical policy because you could never regulate the speech in real time. All you could really do is chill the speech of networks so that their news operations would be less robust than traditional print organizations.
Yeah, one other real-world example from the executive order, which I agree looks good on paper. They've started to send out enforcement letters. One of the first ones went to, I think it was North Carolina, University of North Carolina, to a Middle Eastern Studies program that was not sufficiently, according to a Republican state legislator, covering Christianity. And so they didn't take their money away, but they said, we're watching, right? We have reports from this politician that you are not covering minority Christian faiths as you should be. And so, like you said, what could possibly go wrong with the executive order? That.
You want to see administration change on a university campus, threaten their federal funding.
Right. Other questions? Yes?
You had mentioned that it's abuse of power, and a lot of administrations went after the media in different ways. Do you think the fact that Trump does it so openly makes it seem less dangerous to most people?
I don't think it makes it seem less dangerous to most people. I think it tends to normalize it in a way. I mean, for those people who like his style or like what he has to say, the fact that he will say it so confidently and forcefully, they'll go, oh, yeah, he can do that, right? When, for those who have more of an understanding of the history and tradition of the First Amendment, you go, what, are you kidding? What are you talking about? No one can get away with that. And it's one of the reasons why previous administrations saw this as a secret and an embarrassment that they wanted to keep from public view at all possible costs. The only difference is that Trump just doesn't know any better. And he doesn't yet know that it's illegal, but we're hoping to teach him that.
Other questions? One more, yeah.
So what's the way forward? Is it high school civics classes that put more emphasis
Grade
on
school.
free speech? Is it
Kindergarten.
consumers pushing for transparency on Facebook algorithms so that we know what information we're
you
getting?
know, I saw some proposed legislation on transparency. I haven't had a chance to ask my expert friends here, but to me that seemed like a very good idea for people. You know, we should at least know what their algorithms are and how they're steering us. That's one kind of government regulation that at least, okay, so we'll hear I said I would love to hear some, but it wasn't something that I immediately said, oh, that's bad. But I can...
Would you feel comfortable having the New York Times disclose its editorial policies and background discussions on how they make editorial choices?
But this is for particular individuals, the data that they're gathering about you and how they are using that data to choose what they feed you. And I would like to know that about the New York Times, because what they give me is very weird. I'll say this. is. My favorite columnist there, and my liberal friends will kill me, is David Brooks. And I read him every day, and I have to, every day that he publishes a column, he's supposedly conservative. And the New York Times will never feed me David Brooks. I have to go look for it, because I'm sure they've got me pigeonholed as some kind of liberal progressive. So, you know, even from a convenience point
Amazon,
of view.
I ordered a little scale so that I could weigh food to count calories. They think I'm a drug dealer. But to get back to your question, I mean, I agree. Civics education at the earliest possible age.
And
media literacy.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, and you know, basically, the answer is education, and the question is whether or not we're up to it.
I think we are. I really do. I mean, there's so many resources that I've seen from foundations and other philanthropies that are really concerned about these issues and really understand that this is the future. And I think that we can harness all of the new technology in a very positive way to do our own fact-checking, to do our own investigation, to be able to double-check sources in a way that we never were able to before. And despite, I'm a little bit of an agnostic on this, we constantly hear that there are echo chambers and filter bubbles, but there's some contrary evidence, some indication that people who get their information online are actually looking at a broader range of sources. Certainly that's much more feasible, and so we have to encourage people to do that. And I said debate because I've got dear friends, all three of us have been debaters, but seriously, there's a lot of social science evidence that indicates that people who have a debate background are more open-minded. And you all get it in law school, right? You learn that you have to be exposed to all plausible perspectives and be able to articulate and advocate. I mean, that's, you know, and they say that that's training you to think like a lawyer, but that's training you to think, right? Everybody should be able to do that.
Yeah.
One more, yes.
It sounds like what we've just been talking about, sort of this like values change, or how do you get to pushing greater understanding and more education when you have a society right now that is largely ignorant, and there's this attitude that, you know, there doesn't need to be a change.
I think people want change. They just don't know what kind of change they want. And it would be nice if there were someone who could articulate that. I haven't seen them, but then I don't tend to follow political leaders, so I don't know. But I was just going to say, you know, there does need to be some sort of change. I think education is an answer. And yet, as someone who's worked in the First Amendment field for my entire career, it's always been based on the premise that through dialogue we can reach better decisions and that more information is better and so on. And yet we're at a time now, it's an absolute renaissance in information. Everyone has the sum total of human knowledge in their pocket. You know, in a device they can look up anything instantly. You can find facts, you can check lies, and I'm not sure that it matters. And how do we get past that? We have to get past the social media echo chamber. We have to break through polarization and have people actually engage in reasoned debate. And instead of throwing slogans and Twitter, you know, nonsense back and forth, actually talk about ideas. Do people want that? I sure hope so.
And I've seen, you know, there are so many surveys, but I've seen a lot of surveys that indicate the vast majority of people really are hungering for that and are hungering for opportunities to have frank and candid dialogues with people they disagree with. And I've seen an outpouring of organizations that are forming on campuses and in communities. They've got various names. Better Angels is one, Bridge is another that's appeared on many campuses. Even
Intelligence Squared debates.
Exactly,
Yeah.
and even in local communities, libraries are bringing together people to eat together and discuss ideas. So, you know, we can create that ourselves. And I'm thinking, law students, I mean, you're so perfectly positioned to share your knowledge with undergraduates or with high school or younger students, you know, get them to do debates about free speech issues, and really, you know, you'll learn a bit more yourself myself, there's no better way to learn than by teaching, but also be making a major contribution to younger generation.
I think it's more cynical, but I think people are rationally ignorant, right? Given the other demands on their time, right? Is this really that important? I think you have to convince them that it's in their self-interest to care about free speech and press, just like you have to convince them of that in other realms. So the right didn't always support freedom of speech in as robust a way as it does today. It came to that realization over time, right? So it's a huge challenge, right? I don't know. It's good to end on an optimistic note, so maybe I'll just rewind and say what she said. Because I'm less optimistic that whatever the post-Trump era looks like, I think we'll be on the fumes of the Trump era for quite some time. And because the things that brought that era to us, pre-existed, I think they'll continue. We've got to try to find a way out, but I haven't found it. In 135 pages, I didn't try to explain it. So, well, thank you all for coming. Sorry about this,